For 63 years, I lived by one simple belief. If you work hard enough, long enough, and honest enough, life rewards you. I built Harrison's Kitchen from a single diner on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, into a chain of 11 restaurants spread across 4 states. I poured every dollar I had into that first location when I was 26 years old, working the grill myself 6 days a week, sleeping on a cot in the back office when money was too tight for an apartment. My wife Maggie waited tables on weekends while holding down her nursing job during the week. We built that business the way we built our marriage, brick by brick, side by side, without complaint. By the time I turned 60, Harrison's Kitchen was worth close to $8 million. We had a beautiful home in West Knoxville, a lake house in the Smokies we visited every summer, and 2 children who I believed were the greatest things Maggie and I had ever created together. My son Daniel was 34 years old and had been managing 3 of our restaurant locations for the past 4 years. My daughter Claire was 31 and lived in Nashville working as an architect. Both of them had grown up watching me build something from nothing, and I assumed that somewhere deep in their bones, they understood what that meant. I was wrong about one of them. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how I nearly lost everything I spent a lifetime building. Not to a bad economy, not to a bad business decision, but to my own son and the woman he married. And how, when I discovered what they were doing, I made the hardest decision of my life to say absolutely nothing and let them believe they had already won. It started, as many quiet disasters do, with something small enough to dismiss. It was a Tuesday in March, about 14 months ago. I was reviewing the quarterly financial reports for our Knoxville and Chattanooga locations, something I still did personally every quarter, even in semi-retirement. Maggie always teased me about it. "Robert, you have managers for that," she'd say. "You have an accountant for that." And she was right technically, but I never fully trusted any number I hadn't traced back to its source myself. That particular quality had saved the business 3 times over the years, and it saved it again. That Tuesday morning, I found a vendor invoice for restaurant supply deliveries that didn't match what we'd actually received. The invoice was for a company called Ridgeline Commercial Foods, a supplier I didn't recognize. The amount was $4,200, billed to the Chattanooga location, marked as paid. I went back through the previous 2 quarters. Ridgeline appeared 11 times. Over $46,000, paid out over 9 months for a vendor I had never approved and couldn't find in any of our original supplier agreements. I didn't say a word to anyone. I called my accountant Dave privately and asked him to pull every Ridgeline transaction going back to when Daniel had taken over management. What Dave found over the following week made me sit down at my kitchen table and just stare at the wall for a long time. Ridgeline Commercial Foods was a shell company. The business address was a UPS store mailbox in Chattanooga. The LLC had been registered 18 months earlier. When Dave dug further, the name connected to the registered agent was Nicole Harrison, my daughter-in-law. That was the moment I felt the floor shift under my feet. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't call Nicole. I didn't even tell Maggie right away, because I needed to think clearly before I did anything at all. And I knew that if I told my wife, her first instinct would be to pick up the phone and call our son. And I couldn't let that happen yet. Instead, I called my attorney, Warren Hayes, who had handled Harrison's Kitchen's legal affairs for over 20 years, and I told him everything I knew. Warren told me to document every transaction, change nothing, and under no circumstances let Daniel know what I had found. "Let him keep going," Warren said. "Every day he doesn't know you're watching is another day of evidence." So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I went to family dinner that following Sunday and I sat across from my son and his wife, and I ate Maggie's pot roast and listened to Daniel talk about expansion plans for the Knoxville North location, and I smiled and nodded and said, "That sounds promising." I watched Nicole laugh at something Daniel said and pour herself more wine, and I kept my face completely still. That dinner aged me about 10 years. Over the next 6 weeks, Warren and Dave built a paper trail that documented just over $180,000 in fraudulent vendor payments flowing from 3 of our restaurant locations to Nicole's shell company over a period of 2 years. But what Warren uncovered next was far worse than the money. Daniel had been meeting with a business broker. He had quietly, without my knowledge or authorization, begun preliminary conversations about selling 2 of our highest revenue locations. The broker's contact records showed Daniel had represented himself as having majority decision-making authority over Harrison's kitchen operations. That was a lie. The business was structured as a family LLC, with Maggie and me holding controlling interest. Daniel had no legal authority to broker a sale of anything, but he had been laying the groundwork to get that authority. Warren called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and his voice was careful in the way that lawyers' voices get when they're about to tell you something that will hurt. He said Daniel had been consulting with a separate attorney, not Warren, not anyone connected to our family, about the process of establishing power of attorney over a parent with diminished cognitive capacity. The consultations had started 4 months earlier. Daniel's attorney had provided him with information about how to document a pattern of cognitive decline in a parent, what a formal competency evaluation involved, and what assets would fall under POA control. I sat in my car in the parking lot of our original Knoxville location, and I read Warren's summary email on my phone 3 times. My son had been researching how to have me declared mentally incompetent. I called Warren back, and I said, "Tell me exactly how to play this." What Warren and I designed over the next 2 weeks was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. What we designed was a trap patient, careful and completely legal. The first thing we did was update my estate documents fully and completely, without Daniel's knowledge. Maggie and I sat in Warren's office and spent 3 hours going through everything. Warren had strongly advised that Maggie be included as a primary beneficiary. He put it plainly. "Robert, your wife helped build this. She needs to be protected first before any child." We set up a structure where Maggie inherited full controlling interest in the business and all personal assets in the event of my death or incapacitation, with Claire named as secondary trustee to assist Maggie with operations. Daniel received nothing in the updated documents, not a dollar. The second thing I did was begin behaving exactly the way Daniel expected me to. It started subtly. I arrived at a family dinner and mentioned casually that I couldn't remember where I'd parked at the grocery store that morning. I laughed it off, said I must be getting old. I watched Daniel and Nicole exchange a glance, brief, almost invisible, but I caught it. 2 weeks later, I called Daniel from what he thought was my direct line, but was actually a call. I routed through a second phone, and I told him I'd forgotten which supplier we used for our Athens, Georgia location, a supplier I had chosen personally and worked with for 9 years. Daniel's voice had something in it I had never heard before. When he answered, not concern, something more like alertness, like an animal that senses the timing is almost right. I reported everything to Warren. Warren told me to keep going. The most painful night of this entire ordeal came in early May, about 6 weeks into what I privately called my performance. Daniel stopped by the house on a Thursday evening unannounced, while Maggie was at her book club. He sat down in my living room, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized from when he was a little boy. Caught in a lie, this particular combination of false innocence and calculation. He said he'd been thinking about the business, about how much I'd given to it over the years, about how maybe it was time for me to rest and let the next generation take the wheel. He said he'd spoken to a few people about formalizing the management transition, making sure the business was in good hands if anything ever happened to me. I sat down my coffee cup very carefully. I said, "You know, Daniel, I have been feeling a little foggy lately. Maggie keeps saying I should see someone." He leaned forward. He said, "Dad, I think that might be a good idea just to make sure everything is okay. And in the meantime, it might make sense to give me a little more formal authority just so the business doesn't suffer if you're not feeling well." Again, I looked at my son, this person I had coached in Little League, taught to drive, helped move into his first apartment, handed a management position worth a 6-figure salary. And I said, "Maybe you're right. Let's talk about it with Warren." He smiled. He said, "Actually, I've already spoken to an attorney about the paperwork. It would be simpler to handle it separately from Warren." Of course it would. I told him I'd think about it. He left, looking satisfied. I waited until his headlights disappeared from the driveway, and then I called Warren and told him everything that had been said, word for word. Warren recorded my account. Then I called Claire. I had been protecting Claire from all of this for weeks because I didn't want to pull her into something painful before I had to. But that night, I needed her to know. And when I told her all of it, the shell company, the broker, the POA research, the conversation I just had with her brother, there was a silence on the phone that lasted almost a full minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, and she said, "Dad, tell me what you need me to do. That is my daughter. That has always been my daughter." Claire drove up from Nashville that weekend. She met with Warren privately on a Saturday morning, and by the time she sat down with Maggie and me that afternoon, we had a plan that was airtight. Claire would be present at any future conversations between Daniel and me regarding the business or my health as a witness. I would agree in principle to Daniel's request for more formal authority, but I would insist that Warren be involved in the paperwork. This would give Daniel the impression that he was very close to getting what he wanted, while giving us the time to put the final pieces in place. The final piece was something Maggie insisted on, and she was absolutely right. Maggie said, "Before Warren files anything or we confront anyone, I want to hear it from Daniel himself. I want to hear him say what he's actually planning." She said it calmly, the way she has always said difficult things, not with rage, but with a quiet certainty that left no room for argument. I understood what she meant. We had documents. We had transaction records. We had Warren's paper trail. What we didn't have was Daniel's voice saying out loud what he intended to do. Maggie wanted that for herself. We got it in a way none of us planned. It was a Saturday in late May. Claire was at the house. I was in the study pretending to review some papers when Daniel arrived about 30 minutes earlier than expected. He didn't know Claire was there. She was in the kitchen with Maggie when he came in through the front. He knocked on the study door, and I told him to come in. And then he did something that told me the mask had fully come off. He closed the door behind him, and he didn't sit down across from me the way he normally would. He stood near the door, and he started talking immediately without any small talk about how the POA paperwork was ready, how his attorney had drawn everything up, how it just needed my signature. I said I was confused. I said Warren hadn't mentioned it. I said in my most uncertain voice that I wasn't sure I understood what I'd be signing. Daniel said very quietly, "Dad, you don't have to understand all of it. That's the point. You've been struggling, and I'm trying to protect you. Just sign it, and I'll take care of everything." And I said, "What exactly will you take care of?" And then, because he had been planning this for so long, because he had watched me stumble and forget, and seem confused for 2 months, and had fully convinced himself that I was already diminished, because he had forgotten, or maybe never truly believed that I had built something from nothing with my own 2 hands over 4 decades, because he had decided that the man who raised him was already gone. He told me. He said he was going to sell the Athens and Chattanooga locations, the 2 most profitable in the chain, to a restaurant group out of Charlotte that had already expressed interest. He said he'd been in contact with them for months, and the offer was strong. He said with that capital, plus operational control of the remaining locations, he and Nicole could restructure the whole business into something more modern, more scalable. He said almost gently that I had run the business into a kind of stagnation, that my attachment to the original vision was holding it back. He was standing in the study of the house his mother and I had paid for, telling me that my life's work was a form of stagnation. I let him finish. I kept my face soft and slightly blank, the way I had practiced. And then I heard the door behind him open very quietly, and I looked past my son's shoulder, and I saw Maggie standing in the doorway, with Claire just behind her. Neither of them said anything. Maggie's expression was the most painful thing I saw in that entire ordeal. Not anger, but something older and quieter than anger. The look of a woman who has just had a long-held hope definitively extinguished. Daniel turned around and saw them, and the color went out of his face. Claire said very calmly, "We heard everything from the hallway, just so you know." What followed was 40 minutes. I will not describe in full, because some of it does not need to be recorded. Nicole arrived. She had been waiting in the car, which told me she had known he was coming to get the signature today. When she came inside and understood the situation, she did not show remorse. She showed a different kind of calculation, the kind that reassesses odds in real time and looks for a new angle. She said, "I had always favored Claire over Daniel, that this was about sibling rivalry and jealousy, that the business should rightfully have been handed to the son, who had been working it for 4 years. She said these things while Warren's documented evidence of $180,000 in fraudulent payments was sitting in a folder in my attorney's office 3 miles away. I let Maggie do the talking. At that point, my wife, who had worked double shifts as a nurse to help keep the original diner alive, who had never once asked for her name on anything, who had quietly shaped every major decision in our marriage with wisdom I had not always acknowledged as loudly as I should have. My wife looked at Nicole and said with absolute composure, "I think you both should leave now. Our attorney will be in touch." Daniel looked at me. I think he was waiting for me to soften, to walk it back, to be the father who had always given him one more chance. I met his eyes, and I didn't look away, and I didn't say anything at all. He and Nicole left. 3 days later, Warren filed a civil complaint documenting the fraudulent vendor scheme and the unauthorized broker representations. We forwarded the complete file to the Knox County District Attorney's Office. The DA's office reviewed the evidence, and after 6 weeks, filed criminal charges against both Daniel and Nicole. Wire fraud, theft by deception, and in Daniel's case, an additional charge related to the fraudulent misrepresentation to the business broker. Nicole's attorneys reached out to Warren almost immediately. Her attorney's opening position was that Nicole had been unaware of the full scope of Daniel's plans and had simply set up the LLC at his direction. Warren sent a polite reply, referencing the specific transfer records showing Nicole's signature on the outgoing deposits. That particular negotiating position was dropped quickly. The POA documents Daniel had prepared were never signed. Warren had them reviewed by a separate attorney in Nashville, who confirmed that had they been executed, they would have transferred effective control of the business and a substantial portion of our personal financial accounts to Daniel within 60 days. The competency documentation. Daniel's attorney had helped him prepare a record of my supposed cognitive episodes. Written in Daniel's own hand, was turned over to the DA as evidence of premeditation. In the weeks after, I found myself sitting on the back porch of the lake house in the Smokies more mornings than not, drinking coffee before the sun was fully up, listening to the water. Maggie would come out eventually and sit next to me without saying anything for a while, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. She understands that some silences need to be sat in before they can be left behind. I would be lying if I told you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired in a way that was different from any tiredness I'd experienced before. Not physical, but something closer to grief. The particular grief of a parent who has finally had to accept that the version of his child he loved most was partly a story he told himself. I thought about the specifics of what Daniel had done, not the fraud. The fraud was concrete and comprehensible, a recognizable crime with a beginning and an end. What I thought about was the POA plan, the careful documentation of my supposed decline, the months of watching me and noting my habits and deciding which of my behaviors he could weaponize. That required a sustained and deliberate coldness that I still even now struggle to reconcile with the boy I raised. I don't think I will ever fully reconcile it. I think it's one of those things a parent carries. But here is what I also thought about sitting on that porch. Claire driving 4 hours from Nashville without a moment of hesitation. Maggie's voice absolutely steady saying, "Our attorney will be in touch." Warren, 22 years of trust between us, walking me through every step. Dave, my accountant, calling me back on a Sunday afternoon when he found the first irregularity because he said it just didn't feel right. The kitchen manager at our original Knoxville location, a man named Gerald, who has worked for Harrison's Kitchen for 16 years, who called me the week after the story got around the staff to tell me that whatever I decided about the business, the staff would follow my lead. These are the people who are actually inside a life you've built. These are the ones worth counting. Maggie and I updated the estate structure with Warren in July fully and cleanly. Maggie is now the primary beneficiary of all business assets and personal holdings structured through a living trust that protects her completely before anything passes to Claire. Maggie objected briefly to being first. She said it felt like we were planning for something sad. I reminded her that she had worked for it as much as I had, longer than I had in some respects, and that the document was not about sadness, but about fairness, which was something she had been quietly teaching me for 40 years. She stopped objecting. Claire is named as secondary trustee, empowered to assist Maggie with business operations if needed. Everything is clean. Everything is in order. The criminal case is moving through the court system. Daniel's attorney entered a not guilty plea. Nicole's attorney is pursuing a plea agreement. Warren monitors the proceedings and updates us regularly. I don't follow the case closely day to day. I found that checking on it compulsively didn't help me move forward, so I stopped. Warren will tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. What I've spent more of my time on in the past several months is the business itself, but differently than before. I asked Gerald to come into the Knoxville location on a Tuesday morning when it was closed, and we sat down together for 2 hours. I asked him what he actually thought could be better, what was working, what wasn't, where the staff friction was, what regulars had stopped coming, and why. Gerald is 61 years old and has spent his career in restaurant kitchens, and he had things to say that were direct and useful, and that no quarterly financial report would have ever surfaced. I had that same conversation over the following 3 weeks with the kitchen leads and front-of-house managers at 4 other locations. I didn't bring Daniel's name up, neither did most of them, though I could tell from certain silences that word had traveled. By August, I had a working document, not a formal business plan, more of a set of honest notes about what Harrison's Kitchen actually needed in its next phase. Some of it was modernization, which Daniel had not been entirely wrong about, even if his motives were entirely wrong. New point-of-sale systems, better supplier contract terms in 2 locations that were quietly overpriced, a menu refresh in the Chattanooga location that Gerald had been suggesting for 2 years. I brought Claire in on the discussions. She is an architect, not a restaurateur, but she thinks about spaces and how people move through them in ways that turned out to be genuinely valuable. She redesigned the seating layout for the Athens location on a napkin during a Sunday lunch, and we implemented it in September, and wait times dropped by 18 minutes. Maggie, for her part, has started coming by the original Knoxville location on Friday mornings. Not to work. She is retired, and I am not foolish enough to suggest otherwise, but to have breakfast at the counter the way she did 35 years ago when we were first getting started. The staff there knows who she is. Gerald always has her coffee ready when she arrives. I come in about an hour after her most Fridays, and I sit down next to her, and we eat breakfast in the restaurant we built, and we talk about nothing in particular. And for that hour, the world is about as right as it has any reason to be. I'm not the same person I was before March of last year. I think anyone who goes through something like this comes out the other side slightly reoriented, with a different understanding of what was load-bearing in their life and what was merely decorative. I loved my son. I still love him in the complicated, half-buried way that parents can love a child who has genuinely and deliberately caused harm. I don't know what the right word is for that particular feeling. It is not clean. It is not simple. It sits inside me alongside everything else, and I have stopped trying to resolve it. What I have resolved is this. I am 63 years old, and I am not old. I have been trying to retire gracefully for 3 years, and what I've learned from that experience is that I am not someone who retires well, and I've decided to stop apologizing for that. Harrison's Kitchen is growing carefully in the direction I choose, at the pace I choose, with the people who have earned trust over time. My wife is protected. My daughter is part of the work. My attorney and my accountant are people whose judgment I rely on, and who I pay fairly for good reason. A few months ago, one of our longtime regulars at the Knoxville location, a woman who has been coming in for Sunday breakfast since before I can remember, stopped me near the door on her way out and asked if I was doing all right. She'd heard things, she said, the way small communities hear things. I told her I was doing well. She looked at me carefully and said, "You look like a man who got his feet back under him." I told her that was about right. That's the whole of it, or close enough. If you are listening to this, and you are a parent, or a business owner, or someone who has worked a long time for something that matters to you, I want you to hear this plainly. Document everything. Trust carefully, and do not confuse proximity with loyalty. The people who sit closest to you at the dinner table are not automatically the ones who have your best interests at their center. Some of them are. Mine certainly is. Maggie has been at my center for 40 years, and I hope to spend 40 more proving I deserve that. But the chair at the table and the loyalty have to be earned separately, and they have to be re-earned over time. And when the evidence tells you that one has come apart from the other, you do not get to pretend otherwise just because it hurts. You build what you can. You protect what matters. You keep your eyes open. That is what I know.